Okay, very quickly, I'll finish off what I was saying about the SIFT method of looking at poetry. That last T stands for tone, which means the mental or emotional disposition of the speaker of the poem, which may be the writer, but it may not be. It may be some other kind of entity created by the writer. So if you can think of a state of mind or a state of heart, that can be tone. So it could be thoughtful, it could be logical, it could be careless, and those are kind of on the mental or intellectual side of tone. And then we've got the emotional or affective side of tone too, where you name an emotion, it could be a tone. So it could be, happy, sad, angry, frustrated, calm, uh, spooked, annoyed. You name a certain emotional state, and that can be part of it too. So if you're looking at all of those things, that's going to give you kind of a good basic handle on how the poem is working. And we talked a little bit about literary criticism earlier and critical theory. This is really a way for us to get into the formalist literary critical structure or analysis. And that'll be important because uh, knowing how the different gears of the machine work together is really the best starting place for us. All right, I was running low on power, had to go get the power cord and stick it in. Now we're back to ready to roll and to finish. Finally, somewhere near the margin of the poem, give a few sentences that is that surface meaning of that poem, or even a couple of phrases. Where does it start? Where is it going? And finally, where does it end? Um, some people like doing this actually in the book. Some people might just do it in their head. In general, when I tend to find an idea that I like in a poem, whether it's an excerpt or like a turn of phrase that I think is really cool, I tend to want to translate in the margin, say, this person is saying here X. This person is relating idea Y to subject A, or whatever that might be. Now, what's going to be important for us to think about, and I kind of front loaded this at the beginning of the very first video regarding the relationship between two different voices inside Anne Bradstreet. I think it'd be a very worthwhile project for us to take a look at those voices and how they interact with each other. Sometimes with tension, if they're in that same poem, or sometimes they exist fully on their own. So on one side, you've got Mistress Bradstreet. So this is the poetic voice or the poetic entity that is doing what is expected of her as a Puritan woman in the 1600s. So she's being very observant about religion, about her duty, and her belief in God. She's following all the rules. And to be fair about it, she was religious. She was Puritan, but at the same time, she must have at least privately acknowledged to herself that there were deficiencies about the Puritan movement. And that takes place when we look at the voice of Anne. And notice this is a personal, more familial and familiar way of addressing her. And this is a person who's got strong emotional content, um, loves, griefs, fears, a sense of pride, that whole emotional gamut, which in a lot of ways is really pushed to the side and irrelevant to Puritan doctrine. Um, this humanness to her, including her love for her family, her love for her for her husband, for example, and her father. Um, all of those things that kind of keep bubbling up, even though they are not strictly something that the Puritan movement would approve of. And you can also put in this list another range of experiences, which is her wide secular learning that she had. Again, like I said before, her father went to great lengths to help educate her, so she has this whole inner life filled with some of the greatest works of literature of the classical world, and things outside of the Bible that have nothing to do with the Puritan religion and which many Puritans would think are antithetical to the religion. But those things clearly have informed her worldview in some of these poems and have given her a nuanced understanding of the relationship between men and women, for example, and the relationship between people and God, which doesn't always fall into that neat, easy category. Now, for the first two poems I've asked you to look at, the prologue and In Honor of the High and Mighty Priestess Queen Elizabeth of Happy Memory, in the prologue, she basically talks about how she wants to be inspired by a muse to write this great poem. And she does it by invoking this classical Greek and Roman sense of a goddess of poetry. And she does that to kind of hope that she can get across this poem of praise about Queen Elizabeth. And Queen Elizabeth is quite the figure for her because she's a monarch and she's female. And she kind of injects new life into the British Empire at this point. She's seen as a revolutionary figure in terms of kickstarting the arts in England and providing like a broader sense of British and English culture to England. She was also a very, very formidable military adversary as well. So she was a bit like a warrior queen in that case too. So all of these different purposes, some which align with the Puritan doctrine, but many that do not, come together on this Anne side as well. And then in the poem, in the honor of that high and mighty princess, Queen Elizabeth, she compares her to several different instances of heroic queens throughout history. So it becomes an epic poem. And again, this has nothing to do with the Puritan religion. And in fact, the Puritans would probably be like, oh, you're talking about that monarch again? That's not really cool. Then we have some very nice family-related poems. To Her Father with some verses. To My Dear and Loving Husband, which is about as good a love poem as you'll see in American lit. And finally, The Flesh and the Spirit, which basically talks about the push and pull between her body and her emotional states and her spiritual and religious states, and how those are kind of in conflict with each other as actual voices or characters. And again, a little bit more historical context. Queen Elizabeth really helps to, in some ways, modernize England and to take it out of its rut, improve literacy, improve the arts, and to kind of refashion the national image and the international image. She was also known as the Virgin Queen, and that was because she never married. And why they would assume that she was virgin, even though she was never married, is just part of the patriarchal bias of the time. There were some kings that didn't marry or didn't marry until much later, but nobody assumed that they were necessarily virgins or not. And once again, that's feeding into this double standard that was very, very prevalent during the time. We have a later, more stern portrait of her here right now, once again, totally frilled out. But you can see the way in which she is portrayed as a strong leader, someone who's formidable, and in some ways becomes, a really important symbol of female agency for both the English and the colonials during this time. So that's it for our introductory material on Anne Bradstreet. John Winthrop and Cotton Mather are coming up next. Make sure to take some time to look for those videos too. And we'll continue this conversation about the Puritans. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you soon.